She was once the richest woman in the United States. Not by inheritance alone, not by marriage, but by command. At a time when women could not vote, could not easily sit on corporate boards, and were rarely trusted with financial authority, Marjorie Merriweather Post controlled a fortune so vast that it reshaped American kitchens, American taste, and American wealth itself. Measured in modern terms, her assets would have placed her among the wealthiest individuals in the nation, rivaling the great industrial dynasties of the age. And yet today, her name is spoken far more often in connection with a single house in Palm Beach than with the immense fortune that once made her untouchable. That contrast is where her story truly begins. Marjorie's ascent did not start in boardrooms or ballrooms, but with a death. In May of 1914, her father, C.W. Post, ended his life at his California estate after years of declining health. He was 59 years old. Marjorie was just 27. Overnight, she inherited control of the Post and Cereal Company and a personal fortune of roughly $20 million, an amount so large that few Americans, men or women, ever encountered it. The inheritance did not nearly make her rich. It placed her at the center of one of the fastest-growing consumer empires in the country. At a moment when American industry was consolidating power on an unprecedented scale, unlike many heirs of the Gilded Age, Marjorie was not unprepared. Her father had involved her in business from childhood, bringing her into meetings, explaining financial decisions, and expecting her to understand the mechanics of manufacturing and marketing, long before such knowledge was considered appropriate for a young woman. She absorbed those lessons with precision. By her 20s, she could read balance sheets fluently and understood how branding and distribution turned simple products into national necessities. This foundation allowed her to step into leadership rather than retreat behind male intermediaries. Though the world around her still expected her to do exactly that, the fortune she inherited was not static wealth sitting quietly in banks. It was a living machine. Post and products were sold in millions of American households, and the company was expanding rapidly, feeding on aggressive advertising and a growing middle class eager for convenience and modernity. Every year, the empire grew larger, more profitable, and more complex. Marjorie stood at the center of it, holding power that the era's social norms barely acknowledged, let alone respected. She could not vote in presidential elections, but she could influence markets. She could not easily command public authority, but she could command capital on a scale that shaped daily American life. At this moment, her fortune appeared indestructible. It survived recessions, outpaced competitors, and expanded into new industries with relentless confidence. There was no reason to believe it would ever meaningfully decline. The wealth was too diversified, the demand too constant, the brand too embedded in American culture. Yet embedded within this unprecedented success was a quiet contradiction. The fortune that made Marjorie Merriweather Post untouchable also set her on a path where maintaining power would prove far more difficult than acquiring it. And long before the losses became visible, the conditions that would erode America's greatest personal fortune were already taking shape. By the early 1920s, Marjorie Merriweather Post no longer merely owned a successful company. She presided over a corporate organism that was expanding faster than any single individual could easily control. The Post and Cereal Company, once a focused enterprise built around a handful of products, was transforming into something far larger and more ambitious. This transformation did not happen by accident. It was driven by Marjorie's appetite for scale and her belief that dominance, not comfort, was the only real protection in American business. If her father had built a fortune, she intended to turn it into an empire. The decision that defined this era of her life was not a purchase, but a partnership. When Marjorie married Edward Francis Hutton in 1920, she gained more than a husband. She gained a strategist. Hutton was a financier with sharp instincts and a tolerance for risk that matched the aggressive economic mood of the decade. Together, they restructured Postum into a publicly traded company, while ensuring Marjorie retained controlling interest. This move unlocked access to capital on a scale private ownership could not provide. It also marked the moment when the company's growth began to outpace her personal reach. Going public brought legitimacy, liquidity, and national attention. It also introduced a permanent shift in power dynamics. Shareholders, analysts, bankers, and regulators now had stakes in decisions that once belonged to a single family. Marjorie remained the majority owner, but ownership was no longer synonymous with control. Layers of management, legal obligations, and market expectations grew thicker with each passing year. The empire expanded, but the distance between its center and its edges widened. The acquisitions that followed were breathtaking in their ambition. In 1925, General Foods purchased J.Lo, a struggling brand that would soon become a cultural staple. In 1927 came Baker's Chocolate, one of America's oldest chocolate manufacturers. Maxwell House Coffee followed in 1928, embedding the company into American mornings. These were not speculative bets. They were calculated moves designed to ensure that General Foods products appeared in nearly every American kitchen, multiple times a day. Breakfast, dessert, beverages, staples. The strategy worked almost too well. The defining acquisition arrived in 1929, just months before the stock market collapsed. Clarence Birdseye's flash freezing technology promised to revolutionize how Americans consumed food. Frozen products were widely distrusted, associated with poor quality and spoiled taste. Marjorie saw something else entirely. She remembered her mother's endless hours of canning and preserving food. She understood labor. She understood convenience. Against the skepticism of advisors and the caution of her husband, she insisted on the purchase. General Foods paid $22 million for Birdseye's company, an enormous sum for an unproven consumer habit. In hindsight, the decision was visionary. Frozen foods would become a cornerstone of modern consumption. But at the moment of purchase, it represented the height of corporate confidence just as the foundations of the global economy began to crack. Within months, the Great Depression would erase paper wealth across the country. Stock values collapsed. Consumer spending contracted. Corporate debt became dangerous. The empire Marjorie had built was strong, but it was also heavy. And heavy structures feel shocks more deeply. Unlike many male industrialists of her era, Marjorie did not enjoy unquestioned authority in times of crisis. Even as majority owner, she was expected to defer publicly to male executives. Boardrooms were not hostile to her presence, but they were rarely comfortable with her command. Advisors filtered information. Decisions were framed in ways that narrowed her choices. She was powerful, but she operated inside systems not designed to accommodate a woman exercising that power directly. Control increasingly required negotiation rather than command. The sheer size of General Foods introduced another quiet vulnerability. Its success depended on consistency, distribution, and advertising at national scale. That required enormous infrastructure. Factories, supply chains, labor agreements, transportation networks, and marketing budgets all expanded in tandem. Fixed costs rose relentlessly. When demand softened, expenses did not shrink proportionally. The company remained profitable, but its margin for error narrowed. Success had made it resilient, but also rigid. As the decades progressed, Marjorie's role shifted subtly but decisively. She was no longer the architect of daily operations. She became a symbol of continuity, a stabilizing presence whose name reassured investors and consumers alike. Decisions increasingly flowed through committees and executives whose careers depended on caution as much as innovation. This was not incompetence. It was institutional gravity. Large organizations protect themselves first, even when doing so limits the vision of their founders. At the same time, Marjorie's life outside the company expanded dramatically. Her social obligations multiplied. Her philanthropic commitments deepened. Her marriages carried her into diplomatic circles where she served as an unofficial ambassador through hosting and cultural exchange. Each role demanded attention, time, and resources. None of them were frivolous, but each drew her further from the operational heart of the empire that bore her name. The paradox was unmistakable. The very qualities that made Marjorie Merriweather Post extraordinary, her confidence, her ambition, her belief in scale and permanence, had produced a structure that no single person could easily defend. Control diluted not through failure but through success. The empire grew so large that protecting it required systems that inevitably reduced her direct influence over it. By the mid-20th century, General Foods remained a titan of American industry. Its brands were stronger than ever. Its revenues were enormous. But Marjorie's relationship to that fortune had changed. It was no longer something she could steal with precision. It was something she maintained, defended, and justified. The wealth still existed, but it had begun to behave differently. It demanded constant attention. It resisted simplification. And it left little room for personal error. This was the hidden cost of building an empire too large to protect. There was no single moment of loss, no dramatic collapse. There was instead a gradual shift in balance, where ownership ceased to guarantee authority and scale became both shield and burden. Long before Marjorie Merriweather Post's fortune diminished in visible terms, the conditions that would make its preservation impossible were already firmly in place. Embedded within the very success she had worked so relentlessly to achieve. By the time Marjorie Merriweather Post reached the height of her wealth, money no longer functioned as a constraint in her life. It functioned as a language. And the way she chose to speak it was through architecture, land, and objects so rare that ownership itself became a statement of permanence. These were not homes in the ordinary sense. They were declarations. Vast estates designed to signal stability, taste, and cultural authority in a world that increasingly measured power through visibility. Yet beneath their grandeur, these properties introduced a new and relentless financial reality, one that would quietly but steadily drain even the largest private fortune in American history. Marjorie did not build modestly. She built symbolically. In the early 1920s, at the peak of her influence and confidence, she began assembling what would become Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida. The estate was envisioned not merely as a winter retreat, but as a modern palace, inspired by European aristocracy yet rooted in American ambition. Spanning more than 100 rooms and sitting on land that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Worth, the property required rare materials, imported craftsmanship, and an army of skilled laborers. Gold leaf ceilings, hand-carved stone, centuries-old tiles shipped from Spain. Every detail reinforced the idea that this was a residence meant to endure centuries, but endurance comes at a cost. From the moment Mar-a-Lago was completed, it demanded constant upkeep. Salt air corroded metal. Tropical storms damaged roofs and facades. Landscaping alone required full-time crews. Servants, security, maintenance staff, and administrators operated year-round, whether Marjorie was present or not. The estate did not generate income. It consumed it. Millions of dollars flowed steadily into preserving a structure that could never financially justify itself. No matter how priceless it appeared, Mar-a-Lago was only the most famous of her properties. In Washington, D.C., she acquired Hillwood, a sprawling mansion that would eventually house one of the most important collections of Russian imperial art outside the Soviet Union. Hillwood functioned as both a residence and a diplomatic stage. During her years as the wife of U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, Marjorie used her homes as extensions of American soft power, hosting dignitaries, artists, and political figures in environments designed to impress and disarm simultaneously. These gatherings were not indulgences in her mind. They were strategic, but strategy did not exempt them from cost. Each estate operated like a small institution. Art collections required conservation. Climate control systems ran continuously. Insurance premiums rose with every acquisition. Staff salaries expanded as expectations of service grew more elaborate. Unlike industrial assets, these properties could not be streamlined or automated. Their value existed precisely because of their complexity and fragility. The more historically significant they became, the more expensive they were to maintain. Further north, in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, Marjorie developed Camp Topridge, a private retreat that sprawled across thousands of acres. Accessible only by private roads and requiring independent infrastructure, Topridge demanded its own power generation, water systems, and supply chains. The remoteness that made it exclusive also made it inefficient. Every meal, every repair, every improvement required logistical planning. What might have been a seasonal escape for others became, for Marjorie, another permanent financial obligation. These properties did not simply exist in isolation. They competed with one another for resources. At any given time, staff salaries, renovations, restorations, and expansions were underway at multiple locations. Capital that might have been reinvested into liquid assets instead became fixed in stone, wood, and land. While the estates appreciated in prestige, they depreciated in flexibility. Selling them was never simple. Their scale limited potential buyers. Their uniqueness made valuation difficult. Their symbolism made divestment emotionally and reputationally costly. Marjorie's collecting habits further intensified the financial pressure. She amassed European furniture, tapestries, paintings, Fabergé eggs, and imperial artifacts of staggering rarity. These collections elevated her homes into living museums, but museums require preservation, security, and expert oversight. Curators, conservators, and archivists became part of her payroll. Even unused rooms incurred expense, as empty spaces still demanded climate control and protection. There was also a psychological dimension to these possessions. For Marjorie, the estates represented continuity in a life marked by personal upheaval. Multiple marriages, shifting social roles, and global instability made permanence feel elusive. Buildings did not leave. Art did not betray. Land endured. In reinforcing her sense of stability, these properties became emotionally indispensable. Letting them go was never merely a financial decision. It would have felt like surrendering proof of survival. As the decades passed, the economic environment around her changed dramatically. Taxation increased, particularly for the wealthy. Labor costs rose. Insurance markets hardened. The post-war era introduced new regulations and expectations that made operating private estates even more expensive. What had once been sustainable extravagance became an increasingly disproportionate drain. Even a fortune of her magnitude could not escape arithmetic forever. Unlike industrial assets, these properties offered no compounding return. They did not scale efficiently. They did not adapt to economic cycles. They required constant infusion of capital simply to remain intact. While General Foods generated revenue that fluctuated with markets, the estates generated only obligation. The balance between income and expenditure grew more fragile each year, especially as Marjorie's direct control over her business empire diminished. Public perception, however, told a different story. Photographs of glittering ballrooms, lavish dinners, and impeccably dressed guests reinforced the image of inexhaustible wealth. The illusion was powerful. Even as maintenance bills mounted and liquidity tightened, the spectacle suggested abundance. This disconnect made adjustment harder. Reducing scale would not go unnoticed. Downsizing would signal decline in a society that equated visibility with power. By mid-century, Marjorie Merriweather Post found herself in an unusual position. She was asset-rich but increasingly cash-constrained. Her wealth was embedded in objects and structures that could not easily be converted without loss. The estates that had once proclaimed dominance now quietly dictated her financial flexibility. They required attention whether markets were strong or weak. They demanded loyalty long after practicality faded. This was not recklessness. It was the natural outcome of a life lived at the highest echelon of wealth, where money ceases to feel finite until it is already deeply committed. Marjorie had not built these palaces to impress posterity. She built them to anchor herself in a world that often denied women lasting authority. Yet in doing so, she tied her fortune to physical forms that resisted adaptation. The tragedy was subtle. There were no headlines announcing collapse, no creditors at the gates. There was only a slow recognition that the symbols of her success were incompatible with long-term financial preservation. The palaces endured. The fortune that sustained them did not. And long before Marjorie Merriweather Post would begin giving her estates away, they had already begun consuming the very wealth they were meant to immortalize. By the late 1930s. The world surrounding Marjorie Merriweather Post no longer resembled the one in which her fortune had been built. The optimism of industrial expansion had given way to anxiety, nationalism, and looming conflict. Markets were no longer governed solely by innovation and demand, but by ideology, war, and state power. For someone whose wealth was deeply embedded in global systems, trade, diplomacy, and international finance, this shift carried consequences that could not be managed from a boardroom alone. Power was moving away from individuals and toward governments. And even the largest private fortunes would soon discover their limits. Marjorie's marriage to Joseph E. Davies placed her directly inside this new geopolitical reality. When Davies was appointed United States ambassador to the Soviet Union in 1936, Marjorie followed him to Moscow, stepping into one of the most politically volatile environments of the 20th century. The Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin was a nation defined by secrecy, surveillance, and ideological rigidity. Wealth, as understood in the West, was not merely irrelevant there. It was suspect. Marjorie entered a world where private ownership had been systematically dismantled, and where power was exercised not through capital, but through control of the state. Her role in Moscow was unofficial but significant. Through diplomacy by hosting, she represented American culture, stability, and refinement in an environment deliberately hostile to such symbols. Lavish receptions at the Spaso House were carefully curated displays of abundance, art, and order. They were meant to humanize the United States and soften ideological hostility. Yet these performances came at personal and financial cost. Shipping supplies, art, furniture, and food into a closed society required extraordinary expense. Security was constant. Surveillance was unavoidable. Even hospitality became a political act underwritten by her. Private wealth. The experience altered Marjorie's understanding of power. She observed firsthand how quickly wealth could become meaningless when political systems turned hostile. In the Soviet Union, fortunes were not lost gradually. They were erased. Ownership was conditional. Status could vanish overnight. While her own assets remained safe in the United States, the lesson was unmistakable. Wealth survived only as long as systems allowed it to. And systems, she realized, were fragile. As the world edged closer to war, economic instability deepened. Governments expanded their authority over markets. Regulations multiplied. Taxes rose sharply, particularly on the wealthy. The very success of the American war effort would later justify unprecedented levels of taxation and oversight. For fortunes built in an era of minimal regulation, this represented a structural shock. Preservation now required compliance, sacrifice, and adaptation rather than expansion. World War II accelerated these pressures dramatically. Industries were reorganized around wartime needs. Supply chains were disrupted. Labor markets tightened. Inflation reshaped costs. Even companies as large as General Foods were forced to operate within government mandates and rationing systems. Profits continued, but flexibility narrowed. The war demanded efficiency, not extravagance, and it left little tolerance for private excess. For Marjorie personally, the war years intensified her philanthropic commitments. She funded relief efforts, supported military morale, and redirected resources toward national priorities. These actions were sincere and deeply felt. But they also reflected a changing reality. Immense private wealth carried expectations of public responsibility. Hoarding capital in a time of crisis was no longer socially or politically acceptable. Giving became both moral duty and social necessity. The post-war period did not bring a return to the old order. Instead, it cemented a new economic reality. Progressive taxation became permanent. Estate taxes expanded. Corporate governance shifted toward professional management rather than individual ownership. The age of dynastic control was fading. Wealth could still exist at scale, but it was increasingly fragmented across trusts, boards, and institutions. Direct command, once the hallmark of industrial titans, became rare. Marjorie's fortune was particularly vulnerable to these changes because so much of it was visible. Her home's collections and social prominence made her wealth impossible to obscure. Privacy, once an advantage of the wealthy, eroded under public scrutiny and regulatory attention. Governments knew where her assets were. They knew their value, and they taxed accordingly. Diplomatic life continued to shape her world. After Moscow, Marjorie moved through European capitals during Reconstruction, witnessing societies struggling to rebuild from devastation. Old aristocracies had collapsed. Palaces stood empty or repurposed. Entire fortunes had vanished in the chaos of war. The lesson repeated itself across borders. Permanence was an illusion. Even centuries-old wealth could disappear under the weight of political change. These observations subtly influenced her decisions back home. Risk tolerance diminished. Preservation replaced expansion as a priority. Yet preservation proved elusive. Rising costs, taxes, and institutional constraints eroded flexibility. Assets that once symbolized stability, large estates, art collections, global properties became increasingly inefficient under modern economic rules. The world had moved toward liquidity and scalability. Her wealth remained anchored in permanence. At the same time, the cultural meaning of wealth was shifting. Public admiration for conspicuous luxury declined in favor of practicality and social contribution. Excess was no longer aspirational. It was suspect. For someone whose life had been built around visible grandeur, this change carried emotional and reputational consequences. Adjusting meant not only financial restructuring, but identity transformation. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not lose her fortune to a single policy, war, or political decision. Instead, global events steadily narrowed the space in which such a fortune could exist intact. Each new regulation, each tax increase, each geopolitical shift shaved away autonomy. Wealth survived, but it did so under conditions she had not chosen and could not control. By the middle of the 20th century, it was clear that the era which had allowed a single individual to accumulate and command such resources had ended. Power had migrated upward to governments and outward to institutions. Private fortunes could no longer exist as sovereign entities. They were subject to negotiation, redistribution, and oversight. For Marjorie, this realization was not immediate collapse but gradual reckoning. The world she had mastered no longer existed. And while her wealth remained immense by ordinary standards, its character had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a tool of independence. It was an asset under supervision, shaped by forces far larger than any one person. The tragedy was not that her fortune declined, but that history itself had turned against the very idea of fortunes like hers. Surviving untouched. By the 1950s, the decline of Marjorie Merriweather Post's fortune was no longer theoretical. It was measurable, procedural, and relentless. There was no dramatic bankruptcy, no single headline announcing collapse. Instead, the erosion unfolded through contracts, appraisals, and transactions that slowly dismantled what had once seemed permanent. Wealth, when it fades this way, rarely feels like loss at first. It feels like management. And it was under the language of management that one of America's greatest fortunes began to disappear. The first signs appeared in liquidity. The empire still existed on paper, but cash flow became increasingly constrained. Operating costs across her estates rose faster than returns from investments. Taxes consumed a growing share of income. Trust structures, once tools for protection, became administrative burdens. Each year required careful balancing between preservation and obligation. Money no longer multiplied effortlessly. It had to be directed, defended, and rationed. Selling assets was not a sign of panic. It was framed as strategy. Individual properties were evaluated, collections inventoried, and lesser-used holdings quietly placed on the market. These were not fire sales. They were measured, deliberate choices designed to sustain the whole. But every sale reduced optionality. Each divestment narrowed the range of future decisions. Wealth, like a living system, weakens when components are removed faster than they can regenerate. Art was among the first categories to go. Paintings, furniture, and decorative objects that had once filled entire wings of her homes were reclassified from heritage to capital. Auction houses and private collectors replaced curators and conservators. Items that had traveled with her through marriages, wars, and diplomatic postings were assigned values and dispersed. The transactions were discreet but emotionally significant. These objects were not merely possessions. They were witnesses to her life. Property followed. Some estates proved impossible to justify in a modern economic environment. Remote locations, specialized infrastructure, and limited buyer pools made ownership increasingly impractical. Selling such properties required compromise. Prices rarely reflected emotional investment or historical significance. Markets value efficiency. Memory carries no premium. Each sale converted permanence into liquidity. But at the cost of legacy, the structure of her fortune compounded the difficulty. Much of her wealth was embedded in trusts designed to preserve assets across generations. These mechanisms protected against impulsive loss, but they also limited flexibility. Reallocating capital required legal negotiation. Adjusting strategy took time. Time increasingly worked against her. Inflation eroded purchasing power. Maintenance costs continued regardless of market conditions. The system was stable but slow, and stability is not always an advantage during decline. Family dynamics added another layer of complexity. Heirs brought expectations, preferences, and disagreements. What one generation saw as essential, another viewed as excess. The challenge was not simply financial, but philosophical. What was the purpose of the fortune now? Was it meant to preserve a lifestyle, sustain a lineage, or serve a broader public role? Without consensus, decision-making slowed, and delay carries its own cost. Public perception remained largely unchanged. Marjorie was still seen as immensely wealthy, a fixture of American high society. Appearances were carefully maintained. Staff remained impeccably trained. Events continued, though fewer in number and scale. This continuity was intentional. Abrupt change invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites pressure, and pressure limits autonomy. Preserving the image of abundance became a defensive strategy, even as the reality beneath it shifted. General Foods, once the unassailable core of her wealth, no longer functioned as a personal anchor. Corporate governance had evolved. Professional management prioritized shareholder value over individual legacy. Marjorie's influence, while still respected, was no longer decisive. Dividends existed, but they were shaped by corporate strategy rather than personal need. The company she had expanded so aggressively now operated at a distance. Its success increasingly disconnected from her private, financial requirements. The emotional toll of this transformation was profound but understated. Marjorie did not lament publicly. She did not dramatize loss. Her response was pragmatic, disciplined, and inward. Yet there is a quiet grief in watching a lifetime's work dissolve through necessity rather than choice. The fortune had not betrayed her. It had simply outgrown the conditions that allowed it to exist. As assets dwindled, decisions became more symbolic. Which properties to keep? Which collections to preserve intact? Which traditions to maintain? Each choice reflected an attempt to define meaning in reduction. Decline forced prioritization, and prioritization reveals values. What remained was not what generated the most money, but what carried the greatest significance. This period reframed Marjorie's understanding of wealth itself. Money, she realized, was temporary authority. Its power depended on context, systems, and perception. Once those shifted, even the largest reserves could not enforce permanence. What endured were relationships, institutions, and ideas. Ownership was fleeting. Influence, if properly redirected, could persist. The slow sale of her lifetime was not an admission of defeat. It was an adaptation to reality. Marjorie was not undone by extravagance or incompetence. She was constrained by scale, by history, and by a world that no longer supported private empires of her magnitude. The fortune did not vanish overnight. It thinned, piece by piece, transaction by transaction, until its former shape was no longer recognizable. By the time this phase neared its end, the question was no longer how to save the fortune, but how to transform it. Accumulation had reached its limit. Preservation had failed its original purpose. What remained was choice. Allow the wealth to be consumed by obligations, or redirected towards something that could outlast ownership itself. In that question lay the final evolution of Marjorie Merriweather Post's legacy, and the beginning of the most deliberate chapter of her life. By the final decades of her life, Marjorie Merriweather Post had come to a conclusion that few heirs of immense wealth ever reach willingly. The fortune she had spent a lifetime expanding, defending, and slowly dismantling could no longer be preserved in its original form. The question was no longer how to keep it, but how to decide its fate. What followed was not surrender, but redirection. In giving away what she could no longer protect, Marjorie reclaimed the form of control that ownership itself had begun to deny her. Philanthropy had always been part of her identity, but it had once existed alongside accumulation rather than in place of it. Now it became the central strategy. The logic was clear. Assets that could not survive as private property might endure as public trust. What could no longer function as wealth might still function as legacy. This shift marked a psychological turning point. Giving was no longer an act of generosity alone. It was a deliberate restructuring of power. The most symbolic decision came in 1957, when Marjorie donated Mar-a-Lago to the United States government. The estate she had once imagined as a winter White House, a place where American presidents could host foreign leaders in dignity and splendor, had become financially unsustainable as a private residence. Maintenance costs soared. Taxes mounted. Yet rather than sell it to a private buyer or allow it to fragment, she chose to place it into the hands of the nation itself. The donation was layered with intention. On the surface, it was an act of patriotism. Beneath that, it was an attempt to anchor personal legacy within national identity. If the estate could no longer serve her, it might serve the presidency. If private wealth could no longer justify its scale, public purpose could. In doing so, Marjorie transformed a liability into a symbol, even as the government would later struggle with the same financial realities she had faced. Other properties followed a similar path. Hillwood, once her Washington residence and repository of Imperial Russian art, was prepared for conversion into a public museum. The collections she had assembled over decades were no longer viewed as private indulgence, but as cultural assets. Endowments were established. Legal frameworks were constructed to ensure long-term preservation. What had once required her personal wealth to sustain would now rely on institutional stewardship. This process was neither quick nor simple. Converting private estates into public institutions required negotiation with governments, curators, lawyers, and donors. It demanded patience and precision. Each detail mattered, from staffing structures to visitor access. The goal was not merely survival, but relevance. These spaces had to justify their existence in a world that no longer tolerated passive grandeuries. Philanthropy extended beyond buildings and collections. She funded hospitals, schools, cultural organizations, and social services with increasing focus. The logic was consistent. Money spent sustaining private excess vanished quietly. Money spent creating institutions multiplied impact. Influence, she realized, did not require ownership. It required alignment with enduring structures. There was also a deeply personal element to this transition. As age narrowed her physical world, philanthropy expanded her temporal one. These institutions would exist beyond her lifetime. They would speak for her when she no longer could. In this sense, giving became a way to negotiate mortality. Wealth had once offered protection against uncertainty. Now legacy offered continuity beyond it. Critically, this shift allowed Marjorie to define the narrative of her fortune's end. Rather than being remembered as someone whose wealth evaporated under economic pressure, she reframed the story as one of intentional transformation. Assets were not lost. They were reassigned. Control was not surrendered. It was reimagined. The public response was largely respectful, though not always practical. Mar-a-Lago, despite its symbolic ambition, proved ill-suited to government use. Maintenance costs remained prohibitive. The very features that made it magnificent made it inefficient. Eventually, the government would return the property to the private market. Yet this outcome does not diminish Marjorie's intention. Her decision reflected a recognition that private ownership was no longer compatible with the scale she had created. What mattered was precedent. She demonstrated that wealth could exit the private sphere without collapsing into obscurity. It could become infrastructure, culture, memory. The fortune did not survive as money, but as influence embedded in institutions that continued to shape public life. This stage of her life revealed a clarity often absent in narratives of decline. Marjorie did not cling desperately to possessions that no longer served a purpose. She confronted the reality of her circumstances and chose authorship over erosion. Few individuals, regardless of wealth, managed that transition with such deliberate. In doing so, she also challenged the conventional definition of success. Accumulation, she seemed to argue, was only meaningful if followed by intentional distribution. Wealth that ends with the owner ends abruptly. Wealth that becomes public persists unpredictably but powerfully. By letting go, she ensured that parts of her world would continue interacting with history rather than fading into private memory. By the time Marjorie Merriweather Post approached the end of her life, the fortune that once defined her had largely dissolved. But what remained was something more durable than capital. Museums stood where private salons once existed. Foundations operated where estates once consumed resources. Her name, once attached to corporate dominance, became associated with cultural preservation. Giving away what could no longer be kept was not an admission of defeat. It was the final assertion of agency in a life defined by scale. Marjorie understood that history does not remember balance sheets. It remembers structures, stories, and institutions. And in transforming her fortune into those forms, she ensured that while the money would vanish, her influence would not. When Marjorie Merriweather Post died in September of 1973, there was no public reckoning that matched the scale of the fortune she had once controlled. There were no charts tracing its rise and fall, no headlines declaring the end of an era. By then, the transformation had already occurred. The wealth had dispersed so gradually, so deliberately, that its disappearance felt almost natural. What remained was not a void, but a landscape shaped by her choices, where money had quietly given way to memory, and ownership had been replaced by legacy. In life, Marjorie had stood at the intersection of two Americas. She was born into a nation where fortunes could be built by individuals and passed down intact. And she lived long enough to see a country where such concentrations of private power became increasingly untenable. Her story does not fit neatly into narratives of excess or ruin. She was neither reckless nor undone by scandal. Instead, she was overtaken by time itself, by a century that redefined the relationship between wealth, power, and public responsibility. The irony of her legacy lies in its invisibility. Most Americans recognize the places she left behind, but few recognize the fortune that created them. Mar-a-Lago, Hillwood, and the institutions funded by her philanthropy continue to exist, detached from the woman who once sustained them. They have lives of their own now, shaped by new owners, curators, and political contexts. In this sense, her wealth survived only by shedding her name as its primary identifier. Mar-a-Lago is the most striking example of this transformation. Conceived as a private palace, offered as a national asset, rejected as impractical, and eventually reborn under entirely different ownership, the estate reflects the unpredictable afterlife of private wealth. Its survival depended not on the fortune that built it, but on adaptation. The building endured because it changed hands, changed purpose, and changed meaning. Marjorie's original vision dissolved, but the structure remained, carrying traces of her ambition into a future she could not have anticipated. Hillwood tells a quieter story. As a museum, it preserves not just objects but intent. The collections reflect Marjorie's fascination with history, diplomacy, and continuity. Visitors move through spaces that once functioned as private sanctuaries, now open to the public. Here, the conversion from wealth to legacy feels complete. The house no longer consumes resources simply to exist. It generates education, culture, and dialogue. The fortune that sustained it is gone, but its purpose has been clarified. This is the paradox at the heart of Marjorie Merriweather Post's life. She lost one of the greatest fortunes in American history, yet she avoided the erasure that often follows such loss. There was no collapse because there was no resistance to inevitability. Instead of clinging to an unsustainable form of wealth, she allowed it to dissolve into structures capable of surviving without her dot in economic terms. Her story defies conventional metrics. Success is rarely measured by what is given away. Decline is rarely framed as intention. Yet her life suggests a different accounting. The value of her fortune was not exhausted when the money ran out. It was realized when the money stopped being the point. There is also a broader lesson embedded in her story, one that extends beyond individual biography. The era that allowed Marjorie Merriweather Post to command such resources was temporary. It depended on lax regulation, limited taxation, and a cultural tolerance for visible excess. As those conditions disappeared, so too did the fortunes they supported. Her experience was not unique, but it was unusually well documented and unusually self-aware. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Marjorie did not attempt to freeze her world in place. She did not wage war against economic change. She adapted, even when adaptation meant relinquishing what had once defined her. That choice preserved dignity where resistance might have produced only bitterness. Today, her name rarely appears on lists of America's greatest fortunes. Her wealth does not survive in rankings or balance sheets. But history does not remember wealth the way it remembers influence. The spaces she shaped continue to host conversations, educate the public, and intersect with national narratives. These outcomes were not accidental. They were the result of a conscious decision to exchange ownership for endurance. The tragic element of her story is subtle. It lies not in loss but in inevitability. No amount of intelligence, preparation, or discipline could have preserved her fortune intact across such sweeping historical change. The systems that created it dismantled themselves. In that sense, her story is not a warning against excess, but a reminder of impermanence. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not fail to protect her fortune. She outlived the conditions that made protecting it possible. What she left behind reflects an understanding that wealth is a phase, not a state. It accumulates, stabilizes, and eventually seeks transformation. In the end, her greatest achievement was not the empire she inherited or the palaces she built, but the clarity with which she recognized the limits of both. The fortune that once defined her disappeared, but the structures it became continue to exist, reshaped by new hands and new meanings. And in that transformation lies the quiet conclusion of her story. America's greatest fortunes are not always lost in collapse. Sometimes they survive only by disappearing.